Okay, so the next thing I want to do, just like we always do, is I'd like to go over anything from last week that you might have questions on. So the one thing I would like to say is that the live recording, the link didn't work. If that ever happens, just email me. It's usually just me checking a box that I forgot. But if you weren't in class last week, just you can watch this live recording. It's working now. But I didn't get any emails, so I always record the class every week, in case anybody misses it. So it's there now. But um after you've gone through most of this material and watched the videos, um, I also want to say everybody's doing a great job with the discussion board posts. After reading them, I gave you your feedback. Um, there's one I would like to clarify. I gave the example of a relative of mine that had an infected tooth and had the symptoms of schizophrenia. Some people thought I said you could get schizophrenia from an infected tooth. No, the symptoms are the same as schizophrenia, but if they went to the hospital and didn't know they had an infected tooth, they might be diagnosed with schizophrenia when in reality it's not schizophrenia, it's an infection. Um, and I think it was you, Taylor. Did you bring up the UTI thing? Yeah. So that's a classic example of a very specific type of infection, especially in facilities for the elderly. And those symptoms really do mimic schizophrenia or dementia as well. Um, so we just have to be aware of some of the other possibilities that are physical problems. We might not normally think about tooth infections or UTIs or things like that if somebody comes into, you know, a mental health facility. But there's lots of reasons, even beyond some medications we take for other things like, blood pressure and heart and things like that. All right. So beyond that, what about any questions about some of the things you've read, some of the videos you saw? I'm going to read your posts this week, but any questions or comments you'd like to make on any of this with the class? Last week. Last week. All right. Let's move on to this week then. Okay. So I do want to talk about the very first thing that's posted. That's an example of a human services letter. And you can see this is old, but I haven't written a lot since then. And it doesn't really matter which version of the DSM I used in the letter. But there's certain things I did to advocate for my client. So in this case, and once again, the names have been changed, for anonymity, but I just want to read a little from it. So I'm writing this to inform you of changes regarding my client, John Smith. A brief explanation and recommendations will be given. I'm also including records submitted to Family Care Services in the past. These documents will be on letterhead and sent by mail. So that's how they used to want all of the documents. Um, so they actually had to be paper on our letterhead and mailed. Um, so as you will note, previous record, John's been coping successfully for several months with a combination of behavioral modification, parental interventions, counseling, and medication. As recommended verbally, John was given both a psychological and a psychiatric evaluation in November. I concur with Dr. Simpson's diagnosis. However, John has recently been functioning on a much lower GAF level. So even though I was not a big fan of GAF, as you know, um, it's kind of how they talked about levels of functioning at that point. Today, we would just talk about the general ability to function in general. Um, and and here you can see some of the, once again, today we're not using any axes. He would simply have a list of comorbid diagnoses. And he had a lot of diagnoses, major depressive disorder, which I agreed with, child neglect, sexual abuse, ADHD. I didn't agree with it, but as you see, I wrote in parentheses, that's an MD diagnosis. So because I'm a lowly LPC, I can't really contradict a psychiatrist's diagnosis. Um, but I do note that it's not mine. Uh, and a little bit about the history of neglect and sexual abuse. So, so far it just sounds normal. Like a normal letter, a normal update. Client's not functioning as well as he used to. Primary concern at this time is the client's recent violent outburst of anger with some suicidal ideation. During the last week, John has become somewhat violent at home. This is often triggered when John's parents set appropriate limits and a power struggle ensues. John has tried to choke himself and has hit his head against a wall. When questioned about suicidal thoughts, John replied that he does think about killing himself when he becomes angry. John does not have a plan. However, John is impulsive, does not consider consequences, does not have a conceptual grasp of death. At other times, John retreats to a more depressed state, will not talk for a considerable time. He experiences anxiety and stress on a regular basis. So that's what's happening. That's different than before. I would make the following recommendations: that John Smith not be left alone at home, that he be monitored strictly by foster parents. Joneses, they were excellent foster parents. That John will see Dr. Davis, the family physician, for medication as soon as possible. They prefer to go to their family physician. However, I did have him in a inpatient hospital so that they could get him down to a baseline, reassess him, and prescribe new medication. So family physician is just for maintenance. That John will be placed on a waiting list for inpatient programs such as, so since he had all of these changes, you know, so I recommended, and if I prefer a certain hospital, I'll name it. Doesn't mean they have to take him there. This should be 7 to 14-day program that includes new psychological and psychiatric evaluations, review of the diagnosis, medication, due to the mood changes. Families to call crisis if another serious episode occurs. In the future, John's medication should be monitored regularly with appointments every 3 months. Okay, so all that sounds like pretty standard fare. If the medication isn't helping, if his mood and actions have changes, and if there's suicidal ideation. That's a standard letter. But at the bottom, I added something that's not standard. Please note, I'm concerned about John's emotional response if his biological father is introduced to the situation. I have discussed the report with following people. So that one sentence, even though I'm not allowed to make a personal opinion in this report, that one sentence that states legitimate concern uh, has a lot of other implications. So I know that John and was technically still in foster care. The parents were great. They were eventually going to adopt him. But the biological father was pursuing contact with him. And I also know that all of this emotional change took place as soon as John found out that his biological father was pursuing this. So I think, in my opinion, that's the connection. And so if anybody with, a therapeutic background reads that, they're going to know his case already. They're going to know that the father is pursuing this. And just that one sentence at the end, they should be able to put it together. And they did. And they refused contact as a result of it. But I can't ask them to do that. I can only put in not even an opinion, an observation, or a concern. Um, but it's important not to leave that out because that made everything change. As soon as he was reevaluated for meds and everything else, but really, as soon as they denied uh, parental rights with that biological father, who has a long history of abuse, uh, the patient's emotions and actions all leveled out and went back to normal again. So I kind of did the professional thing, and then I had to figure out a way briefly to make my point as well. So sometimes these letters are standard, but sometimes they're a little tricky too. So I just wanted to include one example of a letter regarding diagnostic changes due to environmental changes, just to kind of give you an example. Has anybody ever had to write any of these letters or um, worked with children and youth or child services or something else or the court system with clients?
Clients, my family is sponsored the dog for a long time, so we've had a lot of experience with
Yeah. So there's always these external factors and variables that come into play.
it.
Yeah. All right. So I do just want to say, so I have a video lecture on PTSD and trauma. It talks about most of the things I'm going to share with you. Um, but uh, I do want to say that one of the best books I've read, this one. How many of you have read The Body Keeps the Score? You read it? Yeah, so this book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Um, this is not only a well-written book, but I think it has most of the current research on the subject of not only trauma, but how the brain works, uh, and how it doesn't work after trauma, and then all of the latest treatments on trauma. So, um, so last fall, I taught the course on crisis and trauma. And so it was the first time I taught the course here. And so I got a regular textbook and I got The Body Keeps the Score. And I tried to match up the chapters in each. And as I read the textbook, all of the references in the textbook were from the writers or people that Cole talked about or met or worked with. So I think really this book is better than a textbook um, because it's written by the people who did the actual research and treatment. So if you're going to read a book on trauma or crisis, that's the one I'd recommend. The Body Keeps the Score by Kolk, Kolk. Any any comments from anybody who's read the book? What'd you all think about it?
I actually really enjoyed it. I think it is better than textbook. It's far more enjoyable. But yeah, I would highly recommend it, even if you didn't take a crisis course. I mean, I feel like everybody has to, but I genuinely enjoy it.
Yeah, not all the crisis courses use that book. They use a textbook. Um, but yeah, whether it's assigned in the crisis course or not, I think the examples are better. I think the treatment's better. I think it gives like it's like you're reading uh it's like the person who actually discovered this stuff is telling you about it rather than something secondhand.
Because he tells like a lot of people's stories in the
Yeah.
book, if I remember right.
Yeah, his own clients.
Yeah, I think that's why I like it so much more than a textbook, because we're getting like actual, accounts of things that have happened.
Yeah,
It just makes it
definitely.
more real.
And he even walks you, you know, when people are in the field for as long as this author, it's like he can walk, it's like his own history kind of walks you through the history of treatment, and the different discoveries. So it's almost like a history lesson on trauma as well. I did put a new video up that I have not used before, and it's called Beer is Cheaper Than Therapy. Um, and but it's really about PTSD in the military. And I just think it's a unique population that you're probably going to have to work with at some time. And you know, uh, it's a unique kind of PTSD. Um, so uh, I just wanted you to get that perspective. I probably tell you about this in the video lecture, but my own personal history uh, with PTSD and what really had to do with my upbringing. And my father had been in World War II and Korea and Vietnam. He had been in the military for, I don't know, 20 years and then in the government for another 15. And but back then, they didn't have even the diagnosis of PTSD back in World War II. They were just starting uh, to um, to look at trauma in the military, and so they had other words for it, shell shock, things like that. Um, but they were just refining their understanding of PTSD in the military. And I just remember being a little kid, and every Sunday morning we'd jump on my parents' bed and we'd read the comics and jump on the bed and everything. But one time I went in before they woke up and jumped on the bed. My dad threw me across the room. And, so, I'm pretty sure he had some trauma in the military. Um, after, uh, after he passed away, I had been volunteering for the Red Cross, but, the Red Cross with, with Iraq and Afghanistan started, a new, program called, what's it called? I forget what it's called, but it worked with the Yellow Ribbon program in the military. And, and what we did was when deployed, members of the armed forces returned, from being deployed overseas, they would let them come to, a resort, and their families were at the resort, and they could, be a part of, groups led by, Red Cross workers who were specially trained in it. And, it was called Reconnections. And it's all about reconnecting people in the military with their families and loved ones and helping them in that transition, not only the transition from basically something overseas that might be a war zone to, you know, peaceful area where other people haven't experienced what they experienced, but kind of talking about what to expect, how to be patient, and how to help these individuals reintegrate into kind of everyday life with family. Um, we also did a little screening to see if anybody needed some extra attention. Um, and we also then, after that, included their kids, because a lot of times kids are not included in these services. Uh, Spouses or partners are included, but the kids aren't. So then Mark Lepore actually developed an entire program that included, the children of, armed service members. And, I think it was a pretty good program. And, we did that, for many years. And they still do it, but, there's not, as many deployed now, uh, in areas of conflict. Um, but I think the service members appreciated it as well. Um, so, uh, I think the one thing that, is important about that book, The Body Keeps the Score, is really about what happens to, um, our brains when we experience trauma. And, um, so we all know about fight or flight. Now they call it fight, flight, or freeze. So, you either, protect yourself by fighting back, or you run away to keep yourself safe, or you freeze. And, freezing is a very common reaction. We shut down a lot of our, emotions, and, um, a lot of times, uh, people might, dissociate during trauma. Um, so, but when we think about what happens in the brain, uh, so much of it is related to that fight or flight response, because what happens is, um, you know, the amygdala kind of regulates the fight or flight response, but it gets stuck in fight or flight. And when that happens, the hippocampus continues to produce or signal the brain to produce cortisol, which induces stress, which continues the fight or flight response at a very heightened level. Um, we respond as if we're still in experiencing the trauma because we're stuck in that fight or flight mode all the time. And that's exhausting, you know. It also doesn't allow us to experience other emotions fully, uh, because it's almost as if the trauma is ongoing. So, you know, that's a unique way of, and probably the most advanced way of looking at what happens when, people have the diagnosis of PTSD. The other thing that I kind of want to share is one of the treatments for EMD is EMDR. And in theories, we go over what EMDR is and how it was discovered and how Shapiro came up with it. And there is a book by uh, her, and it's just called EMDR. So rather than reading a book about EMDR, I would just read the one, written by Francine Shapiro, who invented it. If you're interested in EMDR. Um, and in other classes, I've told my own story. So if you're in my theories class, you probably heard my story um, about how I didn't believe in EMDR. Had a student come to my theories class who had graduated and been trained in EMDR, and she asked for volunteers, and none of the students would volunteer, and so I volunteered, and I'm like, I don't really have any traumatic experiences, but I guess I did. Because I came up with this time I was in India and on this train and going through this area of conflict, and they had called out, the military, and we stopped there. It was around 3 a.m. All the military boarded the train. I was about 19 or 20. And I just happened to be wearing military fatigues because I just bought all my clothes either at Salvation Army or military surplus. And so I was the only white person wearing military fatigues maybe that they had ever met. It was in a very rural part of India. And so, not only had these soldiers experienced conflict, but they were exhausted. And here they're confronted with this guy on a train, you know, from American military fatigues, and they didn't really know what to do. So they're screaming at me and, holding their AKs to my head, and things are escalating because they didn't speak English and I didn't speak their language. And eventually I had made friends with this other guy on the train. And we didn't even speak each other's language either, but we were playing cards and I bought him food and hung out with these kids. Very slowly, he got up and stood in front of me, touching me. And because there really wasn't that much room between all of the rifles and me, and he very calmly spoke. And I guess he was explaining that, hey, I'm a nice guy. I'm not in the military. And then the soldiers pointed to a bunk on the train. I got in the bunk. Soldier got in beside me, still holding his rifle. Soldier fell asleep immediately. I was up for the rest of the night, of course. And so I'm doing EMDR with this person in the classroom, and she does the EMDR with me, and I thought nothing of it. And then next semester, I taught the same class. And I'm like, hey, Joellen, you want to come back and teach the class again? She's like, yeah, well, how'd that EMDR work out for you? And for the first time since I was 20, so 20 years at that time, uh, I can honestly say I hadn't thought about that incident at all. And so I'm like, wow, I didn't even think about it. And she's like, I guess it worked. And so now I'm sold on EMDR. So if it works on me, I'm sold on it because I'm a tough client. And the I think that so then I had to start thinking about why does EMDR work? And if you think about how the amygdala regulates the fight or flight and how you get stuck in that hypervigilant mode, and you're getting all these brain chemicals produced, and um, but the other thing is, uh, think about anybody who experiences trauma. Very few would be able to just go to sleep that night and have a restful sleep. I didn't sleep on that train. And what happens when we sleep is we enter REM cycle, REM, and our body processes the events. It could be through dreaming, it could be through brain chemicals. Another thing that happens is spinal fluid enters our brain through our brain stem, and it actually washes our brain. And people really didn't realize this before. But if you don't enter that REM cycle, um, none of these things happen. And so you don't get anything, any of the trauma processed. Nothing actually happens. And I think that I personally think that that contributes to being stuck in that hyper-vigilant mode. And it's not as if the trauma is in the past. It's it's still in the present. So, um, it our perception of the trauma hasn't changed to something that is no longer happening. So I think that's why EMDR works, because one of the things that Shapiro found out is eye movement, when your eyes move back and forth, and when you pair that with a memory of the trauma, and then you move your eyes back and forth, and then you go through a relaxation and go to a happy place, then move your eyes back and forth, and you repeat this a number of times. I think it mimics what happens during the REM cycle and helps individuals to process that event uh, you know, in our minds in a way that probably didn't happen when the trauma occurred. Um, so that's just my personal take on EMDR. Uh, has anybody ever had EMDR that they'd like to share? Or been trained in it, maybe? So there's not a lot of extra training I'd pay for at this point, because training's expensive, it's time consuming. But if I went to any training to like get a certificate or something at this point, it would probably be EMDR training. So after you get your LPCs and you need those CEUs, you might consider EMDR training. All right, and you can watch the rest of the video about trauma, PTSD, criteria, stuff like that. Watch the video about the military and PTSD. Um, there's not as many diagnoses this week as last week. So the other lecture is on conduct disorders. And the film A Dangerous Son that is about extreme cases. And don't watch that video around little kids. There's like bad language and violence and all kinds of stuff that's not suitable for children. So, don't watch it with kids around. Um, the but the main point that I'd like to talk about with any type of conduct disorder is really about severity. So I think severity is really one of the points I touch on about every diagnosis. But I've seen kids with all kinds of conduct diagnoses, and I would have never diagnosed them with that. Um, the kids act out. Um, and the earlier you can address that, the better. Because if somebody, acts out in an aggressive manner physically when they're over 18, there could be legal consequences. So it's really good to get that resolved as early as possible. So in most cases, the conduct disorders, in my personal opinion, uh, don't stand alone. Every time I've diagnosed any kind of conduct disorder, it's been comorbid with some other uh, diagnosis. Uh, Probably the most prevalent diagnosis is neglect or abuse or RAD, RAD, reactive attachment disorder. Um, but I would say the number one thing is abuse and neglect, uh, especially physical abuse. So I don't think I've ever diagnosed a conduct disorder without some comorbid other diagnosis. So um, I'm sure it can happen alone for some reason, but I would say over 90% of the time, look for some comorbidity there. Look for what else is going on in this person's life that leads to a conduct disorder. And it could be gradually over time, but so there could be chemical imbalances. I guess if an individual has a brain injury, like a traumatic brain injury, it could lead to aggressive behavior. If somebody had a brain tumor, it could lead to aggressive behavior. Many individuals um, who have violent actions like shootings or things like that. So if they um, have extreme violence, then when I look at their case history, they've either experienced abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, bullying, or they have some physical problem like a brain tumor, brain cancer, brain injuries. Um, so it's usually either some form of abuse or an actual physical implication there. Um, it usually just doesn't happen out of the blue. Those things are hard to identify, though, sometimes, hard to prevent, um, unless you see some uh, less aggressive actions early on and identify them. Um, so there's really, not as many chapters this week. I know last week it was an awful lot. So this week, not quite as much. You might want to start thinking about that final paper and picking a character and maybe picking some articles from, what I normally do in research is you can go straight to the library online, or you can go to Google Scholar. That's where I hit first, Google Scholar, type in what I'm looking for, and then if I can't download the article on Google Scholar, I just cut and paste the title of the article into our library, and our library will be able to download it. If you need interlibrary loan, it only takes a day now because everything's electronic. So you can get that really fast if our library can't download it immediately. All right. We're at about 6 o'clock and you've got some more videos and lectures to watch. So any comments, questions, sharing, reactions? All right, that's a wrap. We'll see you later.